It seems to me that our Christian society these days has strayed quite a ways from the gospel in some ways. And one of those ways in particular is that it seems like we have somehow gotten in this rut where we think that judging other people is actually a virtue. But Christ said, "Judge not, lest you be judged." And the Apostle Paul, he told the people, "Who are you to judge another master's servant? To his master, that servant stands or falls, not to you." And so in our communities, in our churches, and conversations among Christian friends, I feel like it's all too often that we end up talking about, did you hear what that person did? Can you believe they did that? Can you believe they said that? I would never do that, of course. Or even worse, when you see somebody in a community kind of turn their nose up at somebody and not judge them in word, but in this obvious spirit of righteous indignation, turn away from someone else that they think has somehow fallen short of the mark. The fact that we condone this and that we do this quite often kind of puts us in this dangerous place of being Christians in name only if we aren't following Christ and his commandments. If we're not taking serious the gospel, we run the risk of being hypocrites. So I want to tell you a story. It was a monk in the Egyptian desert in the early times of the monastic beginning, so probably like the 4th century. This monk was a holy old man, but he saw someone else sin and he judged that brother was one of the other monks in the desert. And that night, as he was sleeping or praying, I don't remember, an angel came to him carrying the soul of the brother that he judged. And he told this monk, "Tonight, this brother died. And because you have judged him, God sent me to bring his soul to you to decide where he should go." And so the Holy Father was so shaken up, it was terrified to think that he could decide the eternal resting place of one of the brother's souls. And they say that he was so scared from that he never judged another person ever again. And this story, it teaches us something important, that when we judge another person, we put ourselves in the seat of God, in the proverbial shoes of God. Because it's God's job to judge us. It's Christ who is the judge of the living and the dead, not me and not you. And so, for one thing, that's kind of presumptuous of us to try to do God's job, although we do it all the time. But also, it's a serious problem that we're lacking the tools to be able to do that job. God sees the heart, and we only see the outside of a person. We only see their actions and what they do. And I know that for me personally, I would much rather have God judge me based upon my heart and my good intentions and my repentance, and not just be judged by what can physically be seen that I've done, because there's a lot of things that I've done that I would have liked to have done better at. And God knows that. So let's leave the judging to God. So the Orthodox Christian tradition takes this not judging thing so seriously that it actually even says that we shouldn't even judge ourselves. And that's kind of a hard thing for modern man to do, because our society these days is so like self-centered, is so self-focused. Everything's about bettering yourself and taking care of yourself. And so it's really hard for us to let go of this idea that we should constantly be judging ourselves. Now, there's kind of a good way of examining ourselves, which means that we are attentive to ourselves. We watch what we do and what we think, and we open ourselves to God so that he can show us where we're wrong, so that he can correct us and teach us and heal us and make us better. That's a good kind of self-examination, and that leads us towards a closer relationship with God, and it leads us towards the healing of our souls and our salvation. It's very good. But there's also a bad kind of self-evaluation. And I'm much more familiar with these because I do them a lot. We've got the kind of self-examination that is like the kid in the backseat of the car saying, are we there yet? Are we there yet? And that's like this, okay, God, am I a saint yet? Like, am I a saint yet now? Now, am I a saint? That we're constantly trying to like check off the list of like, okay, I've done that good deed. Okay, I've conquered that sin. And this is again kind of us trying to take over God's job in our life of he's supposed to be the one directing us. And that kid in the back seat would have a much better time if he could just like enjoy the ride and be patient and know that when they get there, they'll be there, instead of complaining the whole time and wondering when we'll get there. There's another kind of bad self-examination, and this is like the classic, bad picture of a Catholic school nun with a ruler in her hand, and she's just sitting and waiting for anybody to make a mistake so she can, slap them as soon as they say something wrong. And this would be us beating ourselves up, waiting for every mistake that we make, every failing, and then saying, you shouldn't have done that. You should be better than that. You aren't worthy of God's love. You shouldn't do that. So this is a very unhealthy kind of self-examination, which actually kind of comes from a broken sort of pride, which expects us to be perfect. And that actually distances us from God, because we aren't perfect, and that imperfection actually helps us cling on to God, because he has to fill in what's lacking in us. And as long as we expect ourselves to not have anything lacking, then we don't have any real need for God. So these are the bad ways of looking at ourselves. But if we just let God do the judging, let him do his job, and let him take care of other people, let him take care of us, we'll find so much more peace and quiet in our minds and in our hearts when we let him have the control. We let him be the one who makes the judgment. And this teaches us something really important about judging and not judging. Not judging gives us more quietude of mind, but not judging also comes from quietude of mind. It's about simplifying our thoughts. So let's say I see some guy break a glass. The simple thought is, that glass just broke. And then, if that's all I think, then I can look around and see, make sure nobody cut themselves, make sure it's getting cleaned up, everything's okay. But most of us don't stop at the simple thought. If we continue from there, then we start thinking, well, maybe that guy was being careless with that glass. Or, hey, maybe he's drunk. Or maybe he's mad at the house owner, and so he broke that glass on purpose. And we start analyzing and thinking, and our minds start going crazy. And before we know it, we've judged the person and, probably condemned them that, maybe it was their bad luck and they deserved to break that glass because they had done something bad, And so there's a line here that's between seeing the fact of what happened and then trying to interpret someone's intentions. And it's in between that line that crosses whether or not we're judging and whether or not we're sinning, and also affects on how simple our thoughts are. So it's one thing to see what happens And it's another thing to try to examine why that happened or what somebody meant to happen. And one of the saints, it might have been St. John Climacus, I don't really remember, he said that every time that we think that we can examine why someone else did what they did, we are falling into a temptation. I mean, that's kind of scary, because I would think we do this all the time. At least I know I do it all the time. But we can't. we need to stop pretending that we can figure out what's in other people's hearts and leave that to God to do. So we can kind of see here that this whole mass epidemic of judgment that's seeped into Christian culture, it comes from the root problem of not simplifying our thoughts, having too many thoughts, of having our minds go wild. And so to really treat the illness, you have to go to where the source of the problem is, and that goes back to simplifying our thoughts. So to simplify our thoughts, we have to cut off bad thoughts. We have to cut off when we start to step over that line from acknowledging a fact to examining someone else's intentions. And in other situations, we have to also maybe stop between the line of a healthy self-examination and when that starts to turn into beating ourselves up or something like this. So there's a lot of places where we have to be able to discern when the simple thoughts end and when the complicated, confusing thoughts start, which means we have to be aware of ourselves and of our thoughts in order to be able to do that. And the goal is that we would stop these thoughts when they pass the simple point and replace them with the remembrance of God, replace them with sobriety, replace them with the remembrance of the gospel and the commandments, and replace them with peace and quietude and prayer. So I think a perfect example of this is probably the life of Helen Keller, which I think most people know, that when she was a little girl, before her teacher came and she was unable to communicate with anybody and her family wasn't able to communicate with her, she was like a wild beast in the house. They tell the stories of at mealtime, she'd run from plate to plate, taking food from here and there and making a mess and, crawling on the table or under the table. And she was just like a wild beast in the house because she couldn't communicate with anybody. But when the teacher came and began slowly to teach her how to talk, began to communicate with her, began to interact with her, began to instruct her, she became this beautiful person who became a wonderful example to the whole world and did a lot of good things in her life. And so it's kind of the same thing with our minds, that as long as we don't try to train our minds, as long as we don't try to stop them when they start going into trouble, then they'll go wild and our minds will just run over us and they'll control our lives, and we won't be able to direct ourselves very well. But just like Helen's teacher taught her how to talk and how to behave, we have to teach our minds how to stop at the simple thoughts and how to remain in peace, how to be quiet, how to remain open to God. And if we do that, just like Helen Keller became a beautiful person, did wonderful things, if we do that so that our minds can remain simple and we can leave room for God to act and to communicate with us, then we'll begin to see what grace God gives to his faithful people. And we'll begin to see what a beautiful thing it is that God abides in the human heart, and his light will enlighten the human mind. And in that purity, in that simplicity, we'll see Christ himself. because God dwells in the pure of heart. So let's do what we can to purify ourselves, purify our thoughts, purify our interactions with other people, and make ourselves a fitting abode for God, so that his light will shine in us, and we will shine like him.